Hey, welcome to the Master Your Mix podcast. My name is Mike Indavina, and thank you for hanging out with me today. Today, my guest is Craig Alvin, and if you're not familiar with him, he is an award-winning engineer based out of Muscle Shoals, Alabama. He has won a couple Grammys. He's worked with artists like Kacey Musgraves, who he won Grammys with, Hanson, Little Big Town, Amy Grant, Vanessa Carlton, and a whole bunch more. And in today's conversation, we have a really interesting chat about a lot of Craig's philosophies on getting your mix set up for success. And one of the really big things that we dive deep on is his use of clip gain and how before he even starts a mix, he's making a lot of decisions with clip gain that not only establish headroom and stuff like that in a mix, but also that allow him to basically never have to change his settings in his plugins or using his outboard gear. All of the work that he puts into clip gain immediately sets this mix up for success and gets all of those tools that he's going to use in the mix reacting exactly the way he wants. So it's not a matter of having to go in and, dial in new fresh settings for every single mix. Instead, just with some simple clip gain stuff that he has combined with his templates, he's able to just get up and running really, really quickly. And we also talk about how clip gain plays a really big part in how he uses tools like compression, not just to get up and running real quick, but also so that he can maintain a specific sound that he's going for. He doesn't think of compression as a dynamic range tool. Instead, it's a character piece. And that's something that comes up a lot as we have this conversation as well, is this idea of tone and texture and how everything we do with mixing is a result of balancing those things. He talks about balancing power, frequency, and time, and those being really the only three things that a mixer has control over. So we dive deeper into that philosophy in this episode, and I just think it's a really, really fascinating one. So with all that said, I think you're going to really enjoy this one. So let's just jump right into it. Craig Alvin, thank you so much for being on the Master Your Mix podcast. How's it going today, man?
It's great. Glad to be here.
For sure. For people who might not be familiar with you and who you are, what you do, and how you got into all this stuff, can you give us that background story?
Yeah, I started recording it's been, I think, a little over 30 years ago now in Portland, Oregon, where I grew up. Kind of came up around that whole scene with, Tape Op Magazine, Larry Crane. He had Jackpot Studio. I was working out of his place and several others. I had a studio there. And then eventually found my way to Nashville and worked in Nashville for, I think, 13, 14 years. And worked with a lot of different people, probably best known for my work with Kacey Musgraves, done a few albums with her, but a lot of other people too while I was there. And then in 2020, I decided to move down here to Muscle Shoals, Alabama, which is about 2 hours south of Nashville. And we built this studio that I'm sitting in, Noble Steed Recording. And this is where I do my work now.
Awesome. What got you into recording in the first place?
My dad was a recording artist, so I kind of grew up around it. He made a lot of records. I spent a lot of time, having to go to the studio and sit around. But then I was a music theory major in college, and I was really good at the ear training part of it. And I was playing bass and singing a lot at the time. And I kind of realized I didn't like doing either one of those because I didn't like going to rehearsals. And I didn't like being on tour. I did a little bit of touring. It just wasn't the life for me. So I thought about it and realized, well, maybe the studio, like engineering thing would work, because when I was in high school, we had an electronics lab in my high school, and rather than take biology, I took electronics. So I had a lot of interest in electronics and a lot of interest in music and all those things. So just kind of, I don't know, I kind of picked me, I guess.
Interesting. Was it all like more or less self-taught, or did you just learn a lot from just being in the studio watching your dad growing up?
I am self-taught. I didn't get to work on a lot of sessions with my dad, although I did do some recording with him. Mostly, I just learned on the session. Like my first home studio I ever had, I bought a 3M M79 2-inch 24 track out of Motown in LA and a Neotech console. And I set that up in a bedroom, and that was my first home studio. So I just dove right in. I didn't bother with the cassette 4 tracks or anything like that. I went straight in.
That's amazing. Love it. And to fit all that in a bedroom is
Yeah.
impressive as well.
Yeah, and I ran a snake out the window into the one-car garage that, was at the end of the driveway, and that was my studio.
Hey, you got to do what you got to do sometimes, right?
Yeah, it worked. It sounded good.
Before we hit record, we were talking about how a lot of your studio has been kind of put together through garage sale finds. Was that console one of those garage sale finds?
Yeah, well, I mean, I have a lot. I think the first piece of real studio gear I ever bought was a Gates stay level that I paid $50 for.
Wow.
Yeah, and I still have it. I still use it. And then recently we just found this about 2.5 years ago. I was at a garage sale here in northern Alabama, and I found, if you look over here, I have a Universal Audio 610 console, the real deal. And I found that at a garage sale. 10 channels. Sounds great. In fact, I'm recording this through that right now. So, if you hear any noise or crackling, it's probably... it sounds good.
That's awesome.
But I'm constantly changing the tubes in it.
Yeah. So the big lesson everyone listening here has to pick up is go to garage sales. Yeah, I was saying that earlier.
Yeah. You have to go to the right garage sales. That's the trick.
Estate sales, garage sales, one better than the other?
Yeah, I've had luck at both, but I don't know. I think a lot of times I just know how to ask the right question. So I have a lot of the guitars I've bought were just kind of randomly in public talking to people, and someone says, "Oh, I've got an old guitar," or there's a guy down the street with a thrift store that's selling guitars, and I picked up a lot of things like that.
That's amazing. I love that.
Mainly, it's just searching is a skill, and you just kind of have to learn it. But almost everything I have here has a story like that.
That's so cool, though, and yeah, definitely makes for fun stories when you're in the studio. I'm sure with clients.
Yeah. I think one of my favorites. I had an assistant in Nashville, and I was talking about how I really wanted to get a Clark DN780 reverb, which is a very specific thing to want. Not a lot of people know what they are, and
is that the one that's kind of modeled after the AMS?
Yeah.
Okay.
It looks like an AMS reverb, but it's silver faced. But I mean, they're just cool sounding reverbs, very 80s. And I was saying I wanted one, and he was kind of bored and sitting off to the side. He kept looking on eBay to try and find one, and he'd be like, "Oh, I found one here for $1,400, or here's one for $1,200." And I'm like, "No, it'll come. I'll just wait." And probably about 2 weeks later, I got a call to go over to another studio, and he came along with me, and we walked into the studio, and there was a Clark DN780 sitting on the floor. I had to step over it to get in the room. And I said, "Oh, is that a DN780?" And they're like, "Yeah, you want it?" And I said, "Yeah, how much?" They're like, "Just take it." And so we call it my free verb. And he was like, "I can't believe you, man. How do you do it?" I'm like, "I don't know. I just wait for things to come to me."
Yeah, I think you need to change your studio name to Horseshoe Studios or something like that.
Yeah.
I love it, man. Well, I'd love to dig into some of your mixing processes, and I'm curious to know, when you start a new project, what's your general approach to starting a mix?
So, for years, I when I was in Nashville, I had a studio where I had a 64-channel Harrison Series 12, where it's like an SSL, except because everything is all VCA controlled, but it had 100% recall on everything. So, and all analog, it's digital recall, but all analog processing. So, I mixed on that for years, and I had that kind of LA, Nashville mix setup that was popular at the time, where you had all your outboard gear and your reverbs and everything, but you never changed anything. You moved the faders, and maybe I would move the EQs on the console, but all of that got saved in the recall. I would just mix that way, and I had my particular analog signal paths, where I would go through this compressor for vocals and this one for snare drum and this one for bass, and I had that whole setup. And when I had to switch over to doing primarily in the box mixing, which is what I do now, I just copied it. So I treat Pro Tools the same way I treated my Harrison console. And I tried to build in all of the same processing chains that I used in the analog world. And I still do use analog inserts in Pro Tools from time to time, especially for things like weird things. Like I have an old Ursa Major space station reverb. I've got a real EMT plate. I've got a funky old spring reverb. I'll still use those on hardware inserts in Pro Tools, but then I commit those so that when I recall the mix, they come back that way.
Is it, so you talked about how like you weren't changing the settings on the knobs of the outboard. I'm assuming it's more or less the same way with your plugins that you're using as well. Is that all possible just because you're feeding it the exact same levels every time?
Yeah, I use clip gain. Like what I used to do is on the console, I used to just change the volume level in Pro Tools and hit the console and set up my gain staging that way. But now I use clip gain to hit the plug-in chains the same way every time. And when I do that, 90% of it kind of falls together when you get that right.
That's very cool. Yeah, I think that's probably something that just takes a little bit of experience to like get those first couple mixes done where you feel confident in those settings, but then once you learn that, then you can
I've got a box somewhere where for about 15 years I wrote down every setting on every piece of gear in the whole studio for every mix. And at first I was changing things a lot. And, not only was I having trouble with recalls, but I also started to notice that when I had there were certain mixes that were just better than others. And I started to notice that the notes on those were always the same. And that when I strayed too much away from that kind of formula, then things didn't sound as good. So then I started to think, well, what if I use that as my starting place? Where I know this is good. Like if I have these, chains of gear set up and I approach it the same way every time, just as a starting place, then I'm already like I said, 90% of the way there. Then I can focus on the creative side of mixing and not worry about the other parts. As long as I know that, this compressor is doing this job and this compressor is doing this job and that, the meters on the master bus are hitting about here, I know I'm in the zone. So that's like I'm setting myself up to win. And as long as I don't get out of that zone, it's going to sound good already. And then I can focus on doing things that actually matter, like, focusing on like tone and texture and style, because that's really what mixing is.
Of course. So then as far as like getting that initial setup for your mix session and doing all of that clip gain, I'm sure by now you've probably got like a certain place on the meters that you like to look for and make sure the levels are coming in at that kind of thing. So you're just adjusting it all there. As far as like your headroom and stuff like that, like obviously the more tracks that are in a session, the louder things are going to get. So are there certain levels that you're generally looking for on your meters?
Well, honestly, that's the more tracks there are in a session, like the more you just have to spend time mixing so you don't go beyond that threshold, that level. I definitely, the pie's only so big. So, and all the tracks, those are the ingredients. And you can't let it, get to be more than that. So I just try to figure out how to make, the best sounding mix with those things and try not to exceed the, kind of the parameters I've set up. If you didn't come up mixing on analog consoles, it's really hard concept to get your head around because like I have here, I'm sitting in front of an API console and I've mixed a lot of records on API consoles. And I just know the mix bus on these boards. And if you get like much into that red, it all turns to mush. And so you just know like, okay, if I'm mixing a big rock, record and I'm like really excited about it and I have the volume cranked and I'm pushing, and then suddenly I look over and the needles are in the red, all the punch is gone. And I have to go back and pull things back. And then suddenly all of your attack and punch is there. Because with analog gear, you're really starting to saturate like the transformers and chop off transients and creating extra harmonics and creating extra harmonics and stuff like that is good to a point. It does start to glue things together and make it sound more musical. But then you do reach a point where if you distort everything, then nothing, it just kind of turns to mush. It's not good anymore. It's not working together to create a pleasant sound. It's just something that, you don't want. So you can only go so loud with analog gear. Right now, with Pro Tools, when we have all this, 32-bit floating point stuff, you can go as loud as you want, and the machine doesn't push back. Tape machines push back and consoles push back. And we always had to learn how to kind of tiptoe right up to that point where it was, where it sounded best. But if we went any further, it started to sound worse. And that's really what I've tried to emulate in my mixing setup is, here are the emulations of the EQs and compressors and things that I loved when I was mixing all analog. Now I'm just going to try and use those emulations and the kind of natural saturation that's built into them to kind of keep me in the same, in the same mindset of how to mix. And it works, for a little while. It took me about a year or two to figure out how to completely translate it from the desk into the computer. But now I'm pretty happy with it. And I still occasionally do mix on the desk too.
Well, I think to piggyback on what you said there too, despite the fact that, with Pro Tools and stuff, there's this 32-bit floating point where things don't really distort. There still are some analog model plugins that do have that distortion characteristic to it too. So just because you can push the levels in Pro Tools doesn't mean you should, because there's still plugins that are still sort of reacting the same way a console would too. Or if you push them too loud, they're going to have an artifact to that,
Exactly. And that's why I tried to emulate all of my regular analog chains in the box, because I knew that with those things in the same place, they would more or less do the same thing. And, it is something that kind of takes a little while to wrap your head around it. And you do have to take notes and pay a lot of attention and try to start from the same place every time, And there's really, mixing is one of those funny things because everybody assumes they can do it. And, it really is true. Everybody just thinks, how hard can it be? But it's I'm not a good guitar player. I know a few chords, but, I would never go play a gig. But I own really, really nice guitars. That doesn't mean I can go play a session. And just because you have mixing tools doesn't mean that you can mix a song. Even if you have great taste in music and all about which revision of 1176 does what, and you've watched all the Eric Valentine videos, you still don't know how to mix until you spend the time practicing. And the way you get better at mixing is by sucking at mixing for a very long time. You will you'll have breakthroughs, but you'll also hit a wall and not get any better for a while. And it's terribly frustrating, but you just have to kind of grit your teeth and get through it. You have to do it every day. And, I was fortunate in that I was working in a studio back when there were studio jobs, and I got to just practice mixing all the time. And the one thing that I don't think people quite realize is that if you're an engineer, you're always mixing. Everything is mixing. When you're pulling up drum sounds, that's mixing. When you are dialing in, when you're tracking bass and you're dialing in the compressor, you're mixing. When you're setting up headphones for people, that's mixing. And there are people who are good at it, and there are a lot of people who are really, really, really bad at it. And you have to practice that like it's your instrument. You really have to practice it. So if you want to be good at it, you can probably get good at it, but don't assume that you're good at it just because you've watched a bunch of YouTube videos, or, you were in the studio once with a guy who was good at it. Like it took me years of being in the studio and watching people who were really good at it before I really managed to, start getting consistent, and, and I was happy with what I was, the product I was turning out.
Fair. Yeah. I was going to ask about that. Like, how long did you feel like you had to suck for before you felt confident in it, but I think that's like, I think that's something a lot of people struggle with, especially early on, right? Like they do watch the videos, they read all this information, they try it, and then they're like, oh, why doesn't it sound good? And so it's okay to, like, people need to hear that permission of, like, it's okay to suck,
Yeah. It's funny. If you think that you like mixing, it's weird because, like, it is, for me, it's a job. I still like it, but it is a job. But it's sort of like, if you have a favorite restaurant that you love to go to, don't get a job there, because within 2 weeks you won't like it anymore. Mixing and doing music with your friends and playing around with software and plugging in, hardware and all that, that's all great fun, and it should be enjoyed by a lot of people. But we just, there's not a lot of room for, like, professional mixers to exist. And a lot of guys who've been doing it, like myself, for a very long time, a lot of us are, kind of starting to, like, well, we have to specialize. First of all, a lot of guys I know will get either like a legacy gig or, working for a particular, celebrity or songwriter or whatever. Or they start, teaching classes, which is fine. But it's not like it used to be where, like, I would have to mix 7-8 records a month, like full records. And that's an insane schedule. And it requires, like, you have to hire help. And, it's a lot of work. That doesn't so much, like, very few people are doing that kind of volume anymore. So it's okay to just enjoy it as a hobby. Like, really just enjoy it as a hobby, and don't assume that this is going to be your career. And if you enjoy it as a hobby for a good 10 years and you just can't keep yourself away from your studio and things are starting to sound good, then maybe you'll turn it into a career. But, I know I meet a lot of people who think they're just going to show up one day and be a mix engineer, and they give it a solid go, and instead they're terribly frustrated by the whole thing, because not only is it difficult to do, but artists can be really picky and really critical, and you have to learn to develop those skills too. And it's not as simple as you might think.
How long did you feel like you had to mix before you, like, when you felt confident? Like, was there a turning point? Like something that made you realize, like, oh, I'm actually good at this now?
I give a lot of credit to Joe Ciccarelli, because early on I got to do some work with him, and I learned a lot from him. I also learned a lot from, like, Reed Shippen and a few others who, people who are friends. But, I think it took me about 10 years before I really felt like I was confident. Now, that was back in the days where you had to get in a room that had, like, an SSL and real monitors, and that wasn't easy to do. Those days were pretty rare. So now that you have Pro Tools or whatever you like to work in, and you can have that at home, and, you can actually work with headphones, I imagine you can make that go a lot quicker. But I had to find something to mix. I had to find someone who would pay for the studio time at least. And then I had to go in and set up the console and calibrate the tape machine and, patch everything in. And, it was a lot of work to do a mix. It's not just like opening up Pro Tools now and start pulling up plugins. So I don't know. I think, you could probably learn it a lot quicker than I did, but, it was a completely different world back then.
Well, I do want to go back to we were talking about clip gaining before, and one of the things that I read about you that I thought was interesting. It kind of makes sense a little bit after having just talked about it. But I read that you will often clip gain your tracks before even sending them to compression. So you're not just like clip gaining a track from like an average level perspective. You're actually going through and often, clip gaining certain spots of a region as well. And I was curious to know a little bit more about that process there, because when people first learn about compression, they learn it as this dynamic range tool that's going to bring down the loudest parts and bring up the quiet parts, and but presumably do all of that work for you. So okay, so yeah, that's why I wanted to take it to with you.
Yeah, so to me, I mean, yes, that is what a compressor does, like on a certain level. But I think of them more like as, I don't know, like when you're cooking, you have to have, like, you want to have acid, you want to have heat, you want to have sweetness, you want to have, like, there's spice. Like, I think in texture. And so, if I want to compress something, a lot of times I'm not thinking about dynamics. I'm thinking about, like, oh, that I know what a 160 will sound like on that, because it has a tone to it. It has an envelope to the way it plays with the dynamics. So a lot of times I'll have like a particular setting on a compressor that I know is like the right setting for the way I work. And rather than turn the threshold knob or the input knob like you would on a normal compressor, I will mess with the track and cut it into pieces and mess with the clip gain so that every part is hitting that compressor the way I want it to get that tone out of it, so that it's offering its texture to the mix.
Yeah, I'm sure you kind of find the sweet spot of every unit and kind of can go off of that.
Yeah, I had a friend call me the other day, and he was trying to figure out, like, how to set I think it was some kind of auto writer plug-in or compressor or something to get a vocal to sit right in the mix. And he was really frustrated. And I said, man, here's the thing. Take the 10 minutes it's going to take you to just listen through the tune and ride the fader so that every phrase sits right. And then you'll have it the way you want it. Because there's no compressor that's going to do that right. It's just not, that's what your ears are for. And you have to decide to take the time to do the job correctly. And every little thing you need to do takes time. And, everything is kind of handcrafted to make it all work together. It's not automatic. There are certain tricks and things that you can do that help, but in the end, you're just going to have to go through the whole mix and think about how every element is sitting and decide what you're going to do with every element in every part of the song to make sure it's sitting where it's supposed to be. And that's why mixes take time, and how you do that just all comes down to your experience and your taste, and a lot of times just the way you think about stuff. And when I don't think about, like, when I think of EQ, I might think like, oh, I just need a simple EQ, so I'll pull up a fab filter. But I'm just as likely to reach for Filter Freak, or like I might pull up a Pultec, or I might pull up Echo Boy and shut the delay completely off and just go through the settings and go like, oh, here's what the Echoplex setting sounds like. Here's what the Memory Man setting sounds like. Here's what the Tube Tape setting sounds like. Because each one of those has a certain characteristic of, not just an EQ curve, but also saturation and texture. And I think about that way more than I think about, like, just EQing. EQing is a fine tool, but I don't know. To me, it's kind of more of a boring way of working on things, where I'm always looking for things to have their own, like, unique texture, tone, place, time that they come from.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. So as far as like dynamic range is concerned, then like you often hear people talk about like, oh, preserve the dynamics of a track and that kind of thing. But people might hear if you're clip gaining things ahead of time and making things a little bit more even, they might say, well, then you're kind of killing some of those dynamics. How do you balance that fine line of like preserving that natural dynamic while still keeping things controlled with your compressors and that kind
You
of
just
thing?
automate it. So if you're taking the dynamic out and it needs some of that back in, when I'm going through and I'm doing a little bit of clip gaining, and I'm usually not doing a lot, I'm just trying to keep it in a zone so that it, like, say I'm running an 1176 compressor, and I know that compressor sounds good within a 3 dB range. I just want to make sure it's not going past that 3 dB range. So as I'm going through and I'm adjusting the clip gain on things, I'm just wanting to make sure that at the loud parts, it's not going past that. And, at the quiet parts, I might turn it up a little bit, but I'm not doing anything extreme. And then when I listen down, say it's a lead vocal, I'll listen to the first verse. And if it's too loud, I'll turn it down, like with the volume, on the fader. And then, I need a little more in the pre-chorus. And now in the chorus, I need to bump it, another dB and a half. And yeah, the waveform, if you look at it, looks like it's all kind of doing the same thing, but I'm moving that volume around. But what I'm doing is I'm keeping the tone and texture of the lead vocal the same throughout the song. Because if you're like in the first verse and it doesn't sound pretty much the same as it does in the pre-chorus and the chorus, then that's going to be distracting and not sound as good. Because again, I'm not going for dynamic control. I'm going for texture and tone. And, that's where the magic is.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree with you about like just using automation to create that dynamic range where you need it to be and not have things poking out throughout the track. So sometimes like controlling the sound a little harder than you think is actually fine because you can still bring it back in if it's important.
Yeah. I one of the things I really hate having to deal with is when I get the comments where people say like, "Are you compressing?" It's like, it's like I just know that someone's been reading Steve Albini. And like, compression is just a tool, but, and yes, you're always going to be compressing, but there are so many different ways to compress something. And, it's not all compression isn't just like running it through, like an 1176 and pushing all 4 buttons in and cranking it up. That's not compression. That's distortion. That's saturation. That's doing a different thing. And there's definitely a time and a place for that. But there are dozens of ways of doing that. And you may not do that throughout the whole song, or you may do it just to an element, or you may put it on a parallel bus, or you may, there's any number of ways to use that sound. But when people ask, are you compressing? It's like, well, yeah, if I'm using like a tape plugin, I'm compressing, and there's any number of ways to do that too, by adjusting the bias and the record frequencies and stuff like that. I'm constantly just messing with the technology, especially the old technology that's now in the computer, because it emulates all the stuff that I used to work with every day. So I just know like how to get a vocal to flatten out nice in the top end by adjusting the bias and high frequency on the record side. That's something we used to do, so I just do it in the computer now. But, any way you want to, if you want to think about EQing or dynamic control or, whatever it is, there's a dozen different ways to approach it. And it's about technique and learning those techniques and knowing when to apply them.
For sure. Yeah, it's all sort of EQ when you think about it to some degree.
It's all volume. Well, technically, there's only 3 things we can mess with, though. Do you know about this?
The volume, panning, depth.
No, because panning is volume.
Fair, yeah.
Yeah, unless you do it. There's another way you can do it with time, but there's 3 things you can mess with. You can mess with power, and you can mess with frequency, and you can mess with time. And those are the only three things that engineers have to work with when we're mixing. Those are the only three things we have. So any effect that you are using or anything you are doing, you're adjusting either the power it has, frequency, or time. So that covers, everything from reverb to modulation to saturation to compression to like anything you can think of. It's going to be a combination of those three elements. And that's all we have to play with. And that's one of the things I think about, which I know that's very much engineer stuff, thinking about the science of it, and I'm not getting out my slide rule and doing that, but that's how engineers think. And I definitely do think about those things. Like if EQing something isn't working, then maybe I need to mess with the time. And I had this happen on a mix yesterday where a vocal wasn't quite sitting right. And I had messed around with compression and EQ and saturation. And I went, oh, what if I need to smear it in the time domain? So I just pulled up an old spring reverb that I have and put on a long setting and tucked that in. And suddenly, because it was taking that initial vocal that I had already done my EQ and compression on, but it was smearing it through the field of time, then suddenly the thing just sat right in the track and it felt nice, And I was trying to avoid using a reverb on that for some reason, but when I decided to do that, then suddenly I didn't need to adjust the volume so much, and I didn't need to try another compressor. In fact, I'd been running 3 compressors on it. I took 2 compressors off and just let the spring reverb do the job, and it worked great.
Very cool. Yeah, and I imagine spring reverb, it's got a character of its own too, so that also helps EQ things. And yeah, again, it's creating that character.
Yeah.
Love that.
Yeah, and when I say that I'm looking for texture and tone and time, when I say time, I'm actually thinking about a particular era of recording. Like a reverb from the 1980s is very different than a reverb from the 1950s. So, and when I'm thinking of reverb that, comes from like a concert hall, that's a different place than a chamber, and those also have, time. You think about a different time when you might use those things. So I'm always trying to use those little triggers to get people to have an emotional response to the mix.
Fair. Well, that kind of ties into one of my other questions that I was curious about, which was that, when I was listening to your portfolio, one of the things that really stood out to me was your use of reverb to create a sense of depth and ambience in a track. And in particular with longer reverbs, that kind of stood out to me. It seemed like it's something that you do use quite a bit. It might not always be the most loud thing in the mix, but it's there and it's providing texture. But I was curious to dig into that because I know that with a lot of reverbs, they can cause muddiness and they can get in the way sometimes, especially with longer reverbs, when you have long tails that overlap things. So I was curious to know about how you go about getting that clarity but still having all of that depth and width and everything that comes along with a verb.
Probably most of what you're hearing is especially when it comes to those longer reverbs, it's probably delay. And so a lot of times if I'm wanting to build a soundscape for maybe a background vocal or a lead vocal, I'll have various delays set up that have different sounds and that have different lengths. And so I might have kind of a cleaner but narrow bandwidth slap delay. And then I'll have another delay that maybe is a 16th and a dotted 16th that are, with some regeneration that I can automate up and down to create little moments of in a verse or whatever. If you just want to accent a little bit of emotion on a particular word, I'll have that in there and I'll be pushing it up. And then I usually have 2 or 3 reverbs, a long, if you listen, on a lot of the Kacey Musgraves stuff, we have stupid long reverbs that are coming from usually a lexicon, where, I mean, sometimes those reverbs are 35 seconds long, but we're bringing those in to make that nice shimmery, like 1980s digital thing happen, and then pulling it back. It's all being automated. And then I'll have longer delays for like long vowel sounds in the chorus, where I'll turn those on and let them kind of ring out. And again, it's all just the tone and texture and length of those is all being done by hand. I'm automating all of this. And there's a lot of stuff that's going on that's like really subtle too underneath, where like a lot of the delays and reverbs you won't even really notice unless you have like headphones on and really listen, or unless you get a copy of the vocal stem and you can hear what I'm doing. In the mix, you're not hearing a lot of it. It's more there to just kind of affect you emotionally and keep the momentum of the song moving forward and to enhance the vocal performance. So I'm not necessarily trying to show off when I'm doing that. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to make it sound like this is the best singer you've heard, for this song. Like they're really giving you their best. That's what I'm trying to do. So yeah, but most of the time, yeah, I'll have 2 or 3 reverbs, 2 or 3 delays, and they're always being turned on, off, automated up, down. And, that's one of those jobs, again, that just takes time. You have to go through and go phrase by phrase, line by line, do a little bit of this, a little bit of that, try things. Half the time, it gets vetoed. Other times people say, hey, turn that up, but, it's just a lot of spending time trying things and listening.
Interesting. So it's not like you just kind of set and forget a reverb or a delay. You're doing a lot of work throughout the track to find the sweet spot for every effect. Yeah.
I mean, again, you can't, it wouldn't make sense to turn 3 reverbs and 4 delays on a lead vocal and leave them. That doesn't make any sense, So, but I will have that many there, and they're all just kind of like there so that I can try things. Turn this on with that word, turn this on with that word, or does the pre-chorus need to be drier than the verse, or does the chorus really need a long stereo delay, or does it just want me to, accent certain words by pushing the mono delay with a lot of regeneration on it? It all just depends. It's all song dependent, but yeah, it wouldn't make sense to just turn it all on and leave it. That would be a mess.
For sure. Do you have any general philosophies on deciding when to go with like a longer reverb versus a shorter one, or delay?
I mean, again, everything we're doing is an illusion. So I am usually trying to, like, if we're going into a bigger chorus or maybe a big bridge, I'm trying to make the thing not just get louder, because we have a ceiling on how loud we can be. And the whole tune kind of needs to be loud to be heard, especially the way we listen to music these days. We listen in cars and we listen in headphones primarily, sometimes with just our phone. But, there's not a ton of dynamic range. So how do you create that illusion that something is getting louder, like bigger musically? And so rather than going just pure volume and making it louder, I make those like more subtle. Like my vocal level changes tend to be somewhere between a dB and 2 dB between like a verse and a chorus. So not a lot. But then again, like thinking about like, how can I do this with, with time? If I'm going to make the vocal sound bigger, I can't just go louder. Maybe I make it go like spread it out over time with like a medium sized plate reverb and a stereo delay that's like, an eighth and a dotted eighth that I then ride the regeneration on and, pull it up and down. That makes it feel like it goes bigger. I'm always trying to think that way. And I'm always trying to give myself a place where there is a place in the song where I know we have to kick this thing into 5th gear. we're going to go, this is the biggest moment in the song. And that's where kind of the most stuff is happening. And so I'm always trying to make those moments, save those moments, so we only have one big moment in a song. And I kind of set my levels for everything there. But as far as rules, I don't know. I mean, I try a lot of things that don't work. And that's, in my setup and kind of in my bag of tricks, I have a whole bunch of things that I'll try, and it's not uncommon for me to get a mix, get it done, and then listen to it the next day and go and tear a bunch of stuff out and redo it all. Because, I'm not, until the thing goes off to mastering, we're really not done. So I'm always trying to find a way to make it better. And yeah, I'm always I'm my own worst critic. So I will be trying to, find better solutions to problems, bring, make the mix sound clearer and fuller and, I don't know, and make it just a better listening experience.
For sure. Well, that actually connects to something else that I was curious to ask about too, which was that I read a tape op article with you where you were talking about how one of your techniques with mixing is that you will often make a mix, get it sounding great, print it, and then maybe the next day you'll almost remix it, and that you often find that you get a better result the second time around. And that sometimes that could even keep going. So I'm curious to just on that note, like, first off, why do you think that is? That like the second mix ends up being the first one, or like?
I mean, perspective, energy, meaning like a lot of times at the end of the day, I've heard the song, so many times, and I'm just I just run out of gas, But then the next morning I show up and it's obvious that I need to change a dozen things. That's pretty common. I don't know. There's something about that process too, that self-editing process that I enjoy, and I just don't have any trouble like throwing something away and trying something new. And, I guess I'm not super precious about it anymore. Maybe I used to be. I think when I was younger, I had a lot more of my ego and my, kind of my worth tied up in it. And now I don't. Like, I just like the process of exploring now and finding better ways of doing things. And a lot of that is subtractive for me. I delete a lot of things that I try. And I think that's probably one of the hardest skills to learn, is just self-editing and going, man, I thought I was cool yesterday. It turns out I wasn't.
Fair.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. For me, I've always personally found that like if I come back to a mix a next day or something like that, that like I sometimes feel like my perception of the mix is gone, because I have heard the song so many times that like my initial vision for where I wanted to go with the mix is just kind of gone out the window, or, I'm just not thinking the same way as I did the day before. So I was curious to hear about that process for you. And, how do you go about like keeping your focus and keeping your eye on the prize or the goal of the mix that second time around?
I mean, to me, it's not like I'm quitting on one and starting another. It's all one mix. That is the process. So
you're not completely remixing it. You're kind of just adding to what you've done the day before.
Yeah, but I'm not afraid to tear things down and start over. I don't know. I think that I just kind of, when my mind gets on a puzzle like that, I don't quit. I don't stop working on it until I'm satisfied. So just because I shut the computer off and go home doesn't mean I've stopped mixing the song. Chances are I'm going to pull it up on my headphones later that night and listen. And the next morning on the way into the studio, I'm going to listen in my car. And I may have a discussion with producer or artist about it and just get a better perspective on it and want to go try a few things. So usually I'll have some ideas about how we might be able to improve it. And to me, like, that's just the process of mixing. You're just always, you're not done until you're done. And, when are you done? I don't know. It's like when everyone's happy, when everyone's like, yeah, I really like this.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, that was something I was curious about too, is that like, I feel like a trap that people fall into is that when they go looking for problems, they'll always find a problem in their mix. And so it can be very easy to lose sight of when the mix is actually done and when it's sounding good. So I was curious about that part for you too, in terms of like, how do you know when you're done?
Yeah, there's yeah, there's really no answer. You just kind of, I know when I feel like when I feel like it's really good, because I don't want to, it doesn't do me any good to put out something that people don't like. So I want to make sure that the people I'm working with are happy, and I want to be happy with it. And really that's what we're looking for. And I'm not a perfectionist. I think perfection is really boring. And a lot of times I'll be trying to build something into a mix that wouldn't be considered like normally good. A lot of times I'll try and find like a color palette that might seem odd for a particular song and just make it work, like kind of work on it and force it to work. Sometimes I'll want something to be a little bit too murky or something to be a little too, spiky or bright or whatever, because I don't know. I think maybe it's just me in that I get bored, I get bored easily. So I'm always looking for something that's interesting to try. And a lot of times, you get your hand slapped and, you can't, not every idea is a good one, but I think it's important to try new things. And I'm always trying to find something that's interesting to me. Lately, I've been, it's hard to explain, but there's a certain type of like saturation, like that I've been loving on mixes that feels like it feels a lot softer than what I typically in my career, especially when I was doing a lot of rock music and indie music. Everyone wanted stuff to punch you in the face, and I still like that sound, but I'm kind of bored with it. So I've been looking for ways to make things be kind of fuzzier around the edges and less in your face, but still more kind of sonically pleasing and just nice to listen to.
That's cool. Yeah, it's just like kind of pleasing your ear. And I guess, at the end of the day too, like people are going to come to you because they appreciate the sound that you bring to the project and not just like the same.
And it's not, that kind of approach isn't right for everything. I still like to mix rock records where, everything is kind of like up front but there aren't many rock records being made these days. So I don't see a lot in that market anymore. I wish I did.
So to kind of wrap it up, like if you had to sum up what a great mix sounds like, how would you describe that?
I don't know. I think you're always trying to just capture people's attention right away. Like it should have some kind of noticeable sonic quality to it that enhances the song. And, it should be reasonably well balanced so that, the way it hits your ear should be pleasant, and pleasant, meaning that it's right for the style of music. So like it creates the right emotions.
Mm-hmm. And I'm sure even when you're like, you talked about getting creative with sounds and stuff like that too, it's still got to be pleasant, even if it's a little different than what people are used to hearing. It's still got to be enjoyable for sure.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are just afraid when they approach their music, they're so afraid of making a statement and standing out and being different that they tend to just default to wanting to sound like something they already like, which is a huge problem with artists, especially people who are developing. If an artist doesn't have like a really strong idea of who they are and how to express that, it's a lot tougher. Our job is a lot tougher because, if I'm in the room with an artist who really, really knows who they are and what they like and how they like to express things, then that's great. We have direction. We know where we're going, and we start working together to do that. And it informs a lot of the decisions. But if someone's just, afraid and they love a particular record by another artist, but they're nothing like that artist, then like that's no direction at all. That just confuses the thing. So I don't know. Trends come and go. I don't think following trends is very necessary or important or even good. I would say just like find your own way and do something interesting, but please don't bore me.
I totally agree with everything you're saying there. And I do think that it is a good thing for people to lean into that differentiating sound, like sometimes that extra character just really can be something that makes someone exciting and makes it a breath of fresh air for people to listen to. So yeah, definitely agree with that. Well, Craig, this has been awesome. Like I've loved learning more about your philosophies and all this stuff. And I think you gave us a lot of really great things to take from this and run with in our own mixes. So I appreciate you taking the time to do it. If people want to learn more about you or maybe even work with you, like what's the best way for them to do that?
You can just find me at craigalvin.com. So, or you can find me, I'm on, socials, just Craig Alvin, Instagram or whatever. I'm out there. And then you can also reach me through Noble Steed Music, which is my management company. So there's a link to them through the website too. But yeah, just craigalvin.com.
Awesome. Again, Craig, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. This has been awesome. Really, really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. So that was my interview with Craig Alvin, and I really enjoyed that. I loved how he was able to really distill the big picture, the big process of mixing down to really those three things: tone, frequency, and power, and how every decision that we make throughout that process is making an impact on one of those three things. And obviously, that's just like a real simplified way of thinking about mixing. And those three topics alone can be very deep. But really, when you focus on really mastering each of those steps, mixing can really come together really nicely. And I loved how he was talking about how when it comes to EQ, he's not just going for EQ. He's thinking about all of his tools in his arsenal to create that EQ, to create that character that a track needs, to differentiate it from another track. He talked about using delays instead of an EQ to essentially EQ a sound. That takes a bit of a deeper understanding of playing with your tools to know what you have available to you. But once you do that, that really unlocks a lot of power for you because you now have these creative tools and plugins and outboard gear that can really give you a unique sound, but also simplify your life and not have to worry about like finding exact frequency curves on a FabFilter EQ, that kind of thing. Sometimes just the gear you have available to you has a specific tone, has a specific sound. So you can use that to get a result immediately. So yeah, I just thought that was really cool. And I also really enjoyed learning more about how he uses clip gain throughout that process too, to make sure that he's really utilizing the magic sound of every piece that he has. And that's all by just starting early, taking the time to clip gain everything. Even the way that he's using clip gain with compression, to not think about it in terms of being a dynamic range tool, but again, more of a character tool. I think that's really, really cool. So definitely some really cool things to think about when it comes to approaching your mixes and thinking about tools that are maybe a little outside of your norm to achieve the results you're after. So yeah, I thought that was really, really cool. Loved learning more about Craig's philosophies on that. And I hope you found that fascinating. And if you did, please make sure to subscribe to the podcast. That way you're notified about new episodes each and every week, because we've got a lot of great episodes lined up for you where there's a lot of other great tips in there as well. So definitely make sure to subscribe to the podcast. And if you're currently working on new music for yourself and you're struggling to get the sounds that you want to come out of your speakers, if you're struggling to get the balance correct or get the character you want or the polish that you want, and you need some one-on-one help to help you achieve that, I would absolutely love to help you. And inside of my coaching program, Amplitude, that's exactly what I do with my students. First off, we hop on a call, we establish what is it that you want your music to sound like. Then we talk about what's currently working for you in your process and what's not working for you in your process. And we come up with a clear action plan, step by step throughout the recording, editing, and mixing processes so that you know exactly what steps to take to get that sound that you want. And throughout that process, as you're implementing it, I'm right by your side, giving you feedback, hopping on calls with you, even opening up mix sessions with you and working on the mixes together to make sure that you're getting the sounds that you want. But not only that, but giving you a repeatable system moving forward with all of your other songs so that everything else moving forward becomes much faster, much easier. You have way more confidence, way more speed. And that's what this is all about, right? Making sure that you're able to get the results that you want quickly, but feeling confident in your sound as well. Craig talked about how it does take some time to build up that confidence and build up that speed. And a lot of it really has to come down to just understanding a workflow and getting clear on what that looks like for you. And so that's my goal with this program, is to help bring that to you, help you make that clearer for you, and help you understand your tools better so that you can get the sounds that you want. So if you're interested in learning more about that program, make sure to check out MasterYourMix.com/amplitude. And on that page, there's a link where you can sign up to book a call with me. I'd love to hop on a call to learn more about what you're working on and to see how I can truly help. I only work with people in this program who I really believe I can help. So if that's not you, that's cool. I'll let you know. But if it is, I'd love to talk about the program and what it would look like to work with each other. So once again, make sure to check out MasterYourMix.com/amplitude and you can get all the details there. And with that said, we're at the end of the episode. Thank you so much for sticking around, and I can't wait to chat with you in the next one. We'll talk soon. Take care. Thanks for listening to the Master Your Mix podcast. Please make sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app and leave a review. If you have any questions or comments for the podcast, send an email to questions@masteryourmix.com. And for more information on how to create pro recordings from your home studio, visit MasterYourMix.com.